Sometimes you just want to go with the classics, some of the older stuff that people don't really talk about that much. And that's what I'm here to do today. Sure, I know a lot of you are probably expecting me to talk about Yu-Gi-Oh! Or some newer series, but let's go with something old school today. Let's talk about Zatch Bell. People still remember this show, right? Demon kids running around, partnered with humans, can do spells. Well, you guys know what I'm talking about. But this time, I'm here to talk about a certain arc in particular. An arc that, as a kid, I never got to finish. We're going to talk about the Ancient Mamodo arc. Let's get into it. The arc is pretty simple in some ways. There's an evil Mamodo named Zophis who's brainwashing a lot of ancient or older Mamodo and trying to get them to fight on his side. Yeah, Zophis is a boy. Did not see that coming when I was a kid. Zophis offers a chance for Zatch and Kyo to join him, but they refuse since they're the good guys and everything. And ultimately they realize they have to fight and stop Zophis from becoming king. But they can't do it alone. They need the help of their friends. And thanks to two of them in particular, that's going to be pretty easy. See, earlier in the series, Zatch and Kyo met Dr. Riddles and Kiddo, an interesting pair of a human and Mamodo. Honestly, these two are so much funnier than I remember them being as a kid. No matter how many times I hear the joke of Dr. Riddles coming up with a lie, Kiddo believing it, and then saying kidding alongside Kiddo's reaction, it never failed to make me laugh, no matter how many times I heard it. But anyways, Dr. Riddles and Kiddo also end up recruiting Conchaman Fulgore, Tien Megumi, and try to recruit Brago and Sherry, but that one goes, well, about as well as you'd expect. What I love about this arc immediately is that the heroes aren't being stupid. They realize they're outnumbered, and they actually try to get help. And with everybody progressing and training as much as they've been, it seems like things are going to be a lot easier than if Zatch and Kyo just tried doing things on their own. But despite Zatch and Kyo being the main characters, what I love is this arc isn't even fully focused on them. As good as they look, you could argue some of the other teams look even better. In my opinion, Conchaman Fulgore kind of steal this arc in a way. When these two first appear, they get destroyed by Zatch and Kyo pretty easily, and Kyo doesn't even take them seriously. But as they progress, Kyo starts to notice that some of their more jokey antics actually are able to handle certain enemies. Heck, while everybody's scouting them in the beginning, Kyo's the one person who knows that Conchaman Fulgore's skills are important for the mission, and they end up doing something really cool. You actually get a pretty awesome scene of Conchame being grateful to Kyo for having faith in him. You know, before a giant Mamodo shows up behind them and ruins that. Speaking of Fulgore, boing, boing. Fun little fact, did you guys know that the guy who voices Fulgore in English is the same guy who voices Kakashi in Naruto? I don't really have a joke for that or anything, just wanted to throw it in there and I didn't have a spot to do it, so the more you know. The Ancient Mamodo in this arc are really interesting. Some of their powers are awesome, but it's also nice to see that even though they're brainwashed, they're not fully under Zophis' control. They have some way of thinking for themselves. And we learned that they hate being brainwashed, because who wouldn't? So some of you might be thinking, well, if they hate being brainwashed so much, why don't they all just team up against Zophis? Well, that's not really how that works in some areas. While it would be really easy and simple to just burn their books and send them back to Mamodo world, Zophis has a much more twisted idea. He threatens to turn all of them back into stone, petrifying them for several years, maybe even millennium at this point. We see just how much these Mamodo hate it, and one of them in particular really struggles with it, but we'll get to her in a different point. Or we'll just talk about her right now. We meet a girl named Laila and her partner Albert, and it seems like she's just another mindless subject, but that's not completely true. She's actually more on the hero's side than anything. She hates working for Zophis and wants to put his schemes to an end. It's really cool to see how she's able to stand up for herself more than the other Mamodo, and even though she can't fully attack the people against her, she's still able to help the heroes when she can. But if we're going to talk about the villains of this arc, we need to talk about the best villain. No, not Zophis. Zophis doesn't even come close to this king. Gorgeous Sir Victorine. Oh sweet god, this ridiculous, hammy, over-the-top character. I just love this guy. He's so goofy and adds so much humor to this arc, and he sings and dances. Seriously, my parents got so sick of me singing the Very Melon song.
Very melon!
Very melon! Yeah!
Even though it does seem to distract him for a bit, and Kyo has to ruin that by interrupting him. See what I mean by Contra Man Fulgore's tactics actually can't help sometimes? But anyways, they beat our Lord and Savior Victorine and move on to the next part of the dungeon. After escaping into a town, they finally meet up with Wanrei and Lien again, some old allies of Zatch and Kyo in particular, and they're able to even the odds for a bit. In between this though, we get a really interesting development. One of the Mamodo, Ponygon, joined their team, but he doesn't have a human partner, and for a good amount of the series he was searching for that partner, only for that partner to show up in the end, and his name is Kafk Sunbeam. He seems like a level-headed mature adult, but he's always saying things like groovy and awesome and...
How do you do, fellow kids?
Honestly, he feels more like a JoJo side character than anything, but I still found myself loving the guy, and just how much he does his best to understand Ponygon and give him a bit more courage. It was a cool plot twist to see him finally show up. To break up all the action though, we do get an episode or two of the gang relaxing in a house, and ultimately it also leads to Tia's development. When the series started, Tia thought Zatch was just a weakling, and she didn't really see much value in him. But as Zatch grew, Tia started to recognize just how strong he had gotten, and he ended up saving her in this arc. It does sadly lead to one of my least favorite cliches. Somebody tries to confess something to another character, they keep getting interrupted. I don't understand why this trope keeps happening, especially in shonen and in romance anime. But ultimately, it was just nice to see that Tia was willing to open up a bit and express gratitude to her friend. It was cool. Then we get to something that's probably a little more standard, the group having to split up and fight different Mamodo. Honestly, this one wasn't bad, but I will fully admit I was far more interested in Kanchome, Fulgore, Dr. Riddle's, and Kiddo's fights than anybody else's. For some reason, they were always the group I paid the most attention to during this story, and they end up going against a really insanely powerful Mamodo. But not just insanely powerful, just legitimately insane. Belgium EO. He seems super dangerous, and he is, but he's also kind of a child who just wants to be entertained, and if he's not, he'll destroy everything in his path. And there's also his human partner, Dahlia, and she doesn't even seem like she's controlled, she just laughs a lot insanely and says a couple of words. Probably the easiest money Michelle Ruff has ever made, honestly, I respect it. Speaking of English voice actors, the next time you watch this scene, just remember Belgium's voiced by the same guy who does Madara Uchiha's.
Do not misunderstand it. This is not power of your creation!
So, yeah, have fun separating the two for the rest of your life. Their fight goes on for a bit, and it sadly results in Kiddo and Dr. Riddle's book getting burnt, which means Kiddo has to go back to the Mamodo world. As sad as it is, at this point we also learn Dr. Riddle's backstory. He was a world-famous surgeon who ended up failing his last surgery, and the child he was operating on died. Even in the Japanese version, we learned that that kid was actually his grandson. It makes the bond between him and Kiddo all the more heart-wrenching when you see that it might be coming to an end at this point. But in a really touching moment, Kiddo actually admits that Dr. Riddles did make him a better person, and did make him a stronger person. Especially cool considering the fact that Kiddo gave Dr. Riddles a reason to move on, because after the failed surgery, he became a shut-in. Seeing just how far Dr. Riddles came from that was really awesome to see, and that Kiddo doesn't blame him for their loss, but he actually thanks him for everything that he's done. And then the last act of using their final spell, Kiddo tells Dr. Riddles that he is his king.
It's enough to make a grown man cry.
It's honestly one of the hardest things to watch, and as a kid, I could not get through the scene without crying. Or, you know, as an adult too, but let's move on. Even Contra Man Fulgore, after the battle, admit that they feel guilty that they weren't able to help as much, which really leads more into their story of just not feeling as strong as everyone else, even with how much they've been helping. It's kind of a nice wrinkle to add. I don't mean to go too in-depth on this fight, but it really is probably my favorite out of all of them. I mean, Tia and Wanrei end up fighting a guy with a stick. I know it's not actually called a stick, but that's what I'm going to call it. And they end up going up against a force that asks them who's the most beautiful being, which obviously it's Wanrei, but let's move on. Actually, I'll talk about this one. Zatch and Ponyon end up going against the Mamodo in a really strategic fight, which makes sense since they have Kyo, but they also learn a bit about this Mamodo. He was a former hero who ended up getting turned to stone by Zophis, and honestly feels like his kindness is what keeps him weak, but seeing Zatch's determination makes him realize the error of his ways, and he decides to fight alongside them, before getting his book blasted and getting sent back to the Mamodo world. Nice knowing ya. At this point, Zatch and everyone else are kind of screwed. Zophis is about to team up on them with all of his Ancient Mamodo cronies until Brago and Sherry finally show up to save the day. They take out a lot of the Ancient Mamodo and are aiming straight for Zophis, and it makes sense. We learned that early in Sherry's life, she was friends with a girl named Coco, who was brainwashed by Zophis to be his partner, and that's kind of the reason why Sherry's so, well, messed up. Zatch and everyone else end up escaping and find the Moonstone, the stone that controls all the Ancient Mamodo and heals them, giving them lots of energy. And they run into Laila again, until Laila blasts them. Admittedly, this is when Zatch Bell kind of started to fall off Toonami's radar, so when I first saw this as a kid, this was one of the last episodes of Zatch Bell I saw, so I was always really confused as to what happened. And then I realized what happened. Laila was threatened by Zophis to be turned back into stone if she didn't follow orders, and we just see how petrified Laila is over it. She really hated being kept in stone and would rather have just gone back to the Mamodo world, and the scenes showing her and her trauma of everything going through it is really well done, really makes you feel bad. And it's especially cool that Kyo in particular is the one trying to get her back to her old self. After some pretty chilling scenes of her actually going back into stone, she's saved by her partner Albert, who's still under Zophis' control, but you see that she's finally able to get him to open up. It's a really powerful scene, and honestly one of the more underrated scenes in anime, at least in my opinion. But if we're gonna talk about a certain character in this arc, I've kind of been dodging them for a bit, so let's talk about Penny. One of the few Mamodo who isn't being brainwashed by Zophis, Penny is somebody from the Mamodo world who actually knew Zatch beforehand. She fell in love with him at first sight, and when she finally met him in the human world, he didn't recognize her thanks to his memories getting erased. She got pissy, she got terrifying, and she started attacking him and joined Zophis just because of that. No, that's actually really it. There's nothing deep or thought-provoking to it, it's just that. That's it. Zatch even tells her off. All the horrible things she's done are hurting a lot of people, and she has the power to stop it in some cases. But her and Bianco just keep doing horrible things. And in the next battle, our heroes aren't doing great. They're going up against Demalt and Roberto, and a lot of their spells aren't really doing the trick. Not to mention, they're all exhausted from all the fights they've done before. And it looks like they're doomed until... That's right. Penny and Bianco have decided to join up with our heroes. They finally have come to their senses and realize that they would rather be heroes than stuck under Zophis' thumb. We get to see that Penny and Zatch actually work really well together in terms of their spells, water and lightning together. It's really cool to see, and I'd like to think it would have continued if Penny and Bianco had lasted much longer. They did not. Despite a valiant fight, their books end up getting burnt, and Bianco apologizes and asks for forgiveness when they get back to Mamodo world. And in my opinion, this is when Penny really shines. She decides to use her strongest spell to destroy the Moonstone and save her friends. She even uses her hair as a decoy. See, Sakura? This is how you cut your hair off and be useful in the same arc. You should have tried that. But interestingly, she actually reveals herself right as she's destroying the Moonstone. Her partner Uri was actually really confused by this, but Penny admits that had she not distracted the Mamodo would have destroyed Uri. So it's nice to see that in her last moment she was willing to sacrifice her life, because as we learn, there's a difference between a Mamodo's book burning and a Mamodo dying. Fortunately, Zatch ends up saving her at the last minute and tells her just how proud he is of her. And interestingly, Penny begs for forgiveness, but not for her, but for Bianco and all of the other Mamodo, And in a really sweet gesture, Zatch actually forgives Penny as well and tells her that he does consider her a friend. Is it the greatest redemption of all time? Not necessarily, but I actually think it's a pretty underrated one. Why do I like Penny as much as I do? I don't know. Maybe this has something to do with it, but I couldn't tell you. After some more teamwork and a brand new spell by Zatch and Kyo, they end up defeating the giant Mamodo and his partner, and they finally catch up with Zophis and Coco. Things aren't going so well for Brago and Sherry, though. They're getting a lot weaker because Zophis is manipulating the fears in Sherry's heart, just based on all the horrible stuff Sherry's been through and the fact that Coco was her only friend. But fortunately, Brago's able to help Sherry snap out of it. At the same time, though, it just shows how dangerous Zophis is, even when he's not using any spells. That being said, the fight between all these Mamodo is actually really good. I think one of the things I really like about this arc is that everybody gets a chance to shine. It doesn't just feel like Zatch and Kyo doing all the work. Everybody gets a chance to show what they're made of and show that they've gotten stronger. It's a really cool thing compared to other arcs where people just rely on the main characters. Ultimately, the good guys end up winning, and Brago ends up scaring Zophis into erasing Coco's memories and bringing her back to normal. The day has been saved. Albert even ends up becoming unbrainwashed, and him and Laila have a touching moment. Unfortunately, Laila also wants to go back to the Mamodo world, which makes sense. She was never much of a fighter in her eyes, and now that she's finally free from Zophis, she might just want to relax at home, so I actually was okay with this. They say their goodbyes to Laila, everybody goes home, and we get a really cute, wholesome friendship moment between Sherry and Coco. It's just nice to see that these two really care about each other, and you see the bonds between the two when everything's back to normal. And that's the Ancient Mamodo arc. Ultimately, I don't necessarily know if I'd say this is one of the greatest arcs ever, but I do think it's an arc that's massively slept on. The character development is great. The presentation's nice, a lot of the fights are really good, and they even get some heartwarming stuff. Not to mention some pretty hilarious moments too. It's a shame Toonami was having some issues with Zatch Bell at the time, because if this had played out in its entirety, I think a lot of people really could have loved this arc. But a lot of people kind of start to forget it because the ending gets a little lost for them. Then again, I'm just talking about the dub at this point, but that's how I was consuming Zatch Bell at the time. I know the anime obviously has more after it, but at the same time though, I do think this was the peak of Zatch Bell. It just had a good mix of everything. And with the sequel getting announced a while ago, I'd like to think at some point, if this anime ever got remade, I'd like to think this arc would be done justice. Greatest arc of all time? Probably not, but still, a pretty damn good one, and sometimes, that's all I need to see. But what do you guys think? Did you ever get to this arc when you were first watching Zatch Bell? What do you think of it? Would you ever go back and watch this arc if you can find Zatch Bell anywhere? Just let me know. And let me know what other arcs in anime you'd like me to cover in these videos. Hopefully something I've seen, so recording doesn't take too much longer. Anyways, just let me know, and be sure to like, comment, subscribe. This is Alex saying, catch my heart, very melon. Very melon indeed.
Catch my heart, very melon.